And more breaking news. A man is now facing charges in connection with the death of his ex-girlfriend and her teenage daughter. Police say Baheen Lynch is facing first-degree murder charges for shooting and killing Malika Whiting and her daughter Jairah Biggs at a home in Trenton. Investigators say the shooting happened Saturday morning at the home on West State Street. The mom and daughter were pronounced dead at the scene. No word yet on a motive for the killing.
A 13-year-old girl lies dead in her own bedroom, shot in cold blood. Her mother, gunned down just a few feet away. What was supposed to be a normal night turned into a horrific double murder. Was this a tragedy of jealousy, anger, or something more insidious? In New Jersey, Malika Whiting and her daughter, Jairah Biggs, were found dead, victims of a brutal act of violence. But what led to this? Could a simple family celebration have triggered an unimaginable chain of events? Who killed Malika and Jairah? And why? It was Easter Sunday, a time for family, celebration, and memories made in the warmth of togetherness. But for Malika Whiting and her 13-year-old daughter, Jairah Biggs, that day would be their last. What should have been a peaceful evening in their quiet home in New Jersey turned into a horrifying scene of violence and death. By the time the night was over, both mother and daughter were lying lifeless on the cold floor of their home. Malika was found on the stairway leading to her daughter's bedroom, while Jairah was discovered in her third-floor room. Shot multiple times, their lives were ripped away with shocking brutality. But this wasn't a random act. This wasn't a breaking gone wrong. This was a calculated attack, one that came from someone who once held a place in their lives, someone who should have been a protector. Who could do something like this? What drives a man to murder his ex-girlfriend and her child in the span of a single evening? How far could rage go when it was fueled by jealousy, anger, and a desire for control? As the investigation unfolded, answers came slowly, each discovery more disturbing than the last. The suspect? A man who had once shared a life with Malika, her ex-boyfriend, a man who had been living in the shadows of their past. What happened that night? Was this a crime of passion, an act of retaliation, or was there something far deeper that drove this brutal massacre? The answers were hidden beneath a web of lies and half-truths, and the shocking truth would soon come to light. As investigators pieced together the timeline, a chilling realization set in. This wasn't just a crime, it was the culmination of years of bitterness, betrayal, and obsession. And as the pieces fell into place, one question remained. Who would be left standing in the wake of this tragedy, and what price would they have to pay for it? This is the story of a family torn apart by violence. A story of a woman and her daughter whose lives were stolen in an instant. And a story of the man who would do anything to make sure they were silenced forever. Malika Whiting, 40 years old, had spent her life navigating the ups and downs of relationships, hoping to find peace and stability. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend. And on Easter Sunday, she and her 13-year-old daughter, Jairah Biggs, had celebrated the holiday in a way that many families do. Sharing a meal, laughing together, and cherishing their time as one. But the joy of the holiday would be short-lived, replaced instead by unspeakable violence. They lived in a modest home in New Jersey. It wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs, where memories were made, where life had been built together. The three-story house was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, a place where people should feel safe. But within these walls, that safety would be shattered forever on the evening of April 4th, when Malika and Jairah were found dead. The 911 call came in just after 10 p.m. A neighbor had heard gunshots. When the authorities arrived, the scene they encountered was one of horror. Malika was found on the stairway leading up to her daughter's bedroom. Her body was cold, and her once vibrant spirit had been extinguished. She had been gunned down without warning, without mercy. It was clear that she had no chance to defend herself. Upstairs, in Jairah's bedroom, the lifeless body of a 13-year-old girl lay sprawled across the floor. Jairah, who had just celebrated the birth of her twin brothers months before, had a future ahead of her, a future now stolen in an instant. Shot in cold blood, her life was ended by someone who should have never been in her life, let alone the man responsible for ending it. The investigation into their deaths began immediately, But the questions that loomed over the scene were chilling. Who could do this? And why? Malika's family and friends could hardly believe what had happened. No one had seen it coming. No one had suspected that Malika, in the months before her death, had been walking a tightrope with someone from her past, someone dangerous. Her ex-boyfriend, the father of her child, Terrence Williams, was no stranger to anger or violent outbursts. The relationship between Malika and Terrence had ended years before, but their lives had remained entangled through their daughter. Though separated, they shared custody of Jairah. But Terrence had always struggled with the idea of losing control. Malika had left him, and in his eyes, that meant losing everything. Over the years, Malika had tried to keep her distance, but Terrence wasn't someone who accepted rejection easily. Despite her best efforts to move on, he never truly let go. He watched her from afar, lurking on the edges of her life, always looking for ways to insert himself back into her world. Jealousy consumed him. Malika had found love again, and with that, her life began to change. She moved on with another man, but even in the shadows of their new life, Terrence's obsession had never faded. The tension between the two of them was palpable, and despite their shared responsibility for Jairah, Malika's happiness was something Terrence could never accept. But the final straw came when Malika did something that Terrence couldn't forgive. She celebrated Easter without him. It was an innocent act, a holiday spent in peace with her daughter and friends, but to Terrence, it was the ultimate betrayal. A betrayal he would never forget. On that fateful night, Terrence knew exactly where Malika would be. He knew she had made plans, he knew that she had invited some friends over, and he knew that Jairah would be there. But most importantly, he knew that this would be his moment to make Malika pay for what he saw as her abandoning him. As Malika and Jairah enjoyed their evening together, Terrence was already enacting his deadly plan. Armed with a gun and driven by jealousy and rage, he made his way to their home. He entered quietly, intent on carrying out his mission. The sound of gunshots would be the last thing Malika and Jairah heard in their lives. The first shot took Malika down on the stairs as she tried to escape. The second shot found its mark in Jairah's room. By the time the neighbors heard the gunfire, it was already too late. The horror didn't stop there. Terrence, having completed his brutal act, simply left the scene as though nothing had happened. He had exacted his revenge, taking away the two people who had once been his world. His actions were calculated, his emotions cold and detached. He had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Malika's family was left in disbelief. Her friends struggled to find answers. Jairah's classmates mourned the loss of the young girl with so much potential, a bright future snuffed out far too soon. And Terrence, the man responsible for ending it all, was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until the following day that investigators had their first lead. A tip came in from a source who had seen Terrence leaving the scene in his vehicle. Within hours, the authorities had tracked him down. But even as they closed in on him, Terrence seemed oddly calm, as if he had already resigned himself to what had happened. When he was arrested, his demeanor remained cold. He showed no remorse, no regret for the lives he had taken. The investigation revealed that Terrence had been planning the murders for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. He had been obsessed with Malika for years, and his desire to have her back, no matter the cost, had blinded him to everything else. His obsession had turned to violence, and now 2 lives were lost forever. As the pieces of the story came together, the shock of the murders reverberated through the community. How could someone, anyone, commit such a heinous act against a woman and her child? How could a person become so consumed by jealousy and rage that they would take 2 innocent lives? And why did Malika, despite her best efforts to keep her distance from her past, fall victim to Terrence's obsession? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Terrence's violent tendencies had been a part of his life for years. He had been involved in previous incidents of domestic violence, but nothing had ever been done to stop him. The warning signs had been there all along, but for reasons unknown, they had been ignored. Now, it was too late. Malika and Jairah would never get the chance to live their lives. Their deaths would forever serve as a reminder of the dangers of living with someone who could not let go, of a love turned toxic, and of the ultimate price paid when obsession turns to murder. And for Terrence, there would be no escape from the consequences of his actions. His crime was too great, and his punishment would be one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the investigation began to unfold, the details of the night Malika and Jairah were murdered became more chilling with each new revelation. Detectives scoured the crime scene, painstakingly piecing together the timeline of events, searching for any clue that could explain the senseless violence. Every corner of the house seemed to tell a story: an unfinished dinner on the kitchen table, the family's Easter decorations still up, the faint echo of laughter from a day now gone. But one thing stood out: the brutal manner in which Malika and Jairah had been killed. It wasn't just murder. It was something far more personal, a calculated act of vengeance, the rage of someone who had been seething with anger for far too long. At first, investigators had little to go on. Malika's friends and family described her as someone who kept a tight circle, someone who hadn't been involved in any major conflicts, aside from her tumultuous relationship with Terrence. But as detectives began to dig deeper into Terrence's past, they found something unsettling: a pattern of violence, a history that had been lurking in the shadows, one that nobody had paid enough attention to until it was too late. Terrence's criminal record was no surprise to those who knew him. Domestic violence charges, restraining orders, and threats made against ex-partners, these were all part of the tapestry of his life. Yet, somehow, he had managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system. He had been given second chances, and with each one, his rage only grew more intense, more uncontrollable. He'd been to therapy, attended anger management classes, but nothing seemed to work. Nothing had ever forced him to confront the darkness inside of him. Then, detectives discovered something even more disturbing: Terrence had been stalking Malika for months. He had been keeping track of her every move, watching her from a distance, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. He was obsessed with her, and the thought of her moving on without him, of her having a new life with someone else, had become unbearable. His jealousy festered, his hatred grew. But it wasn't just about Malika. It was about control. Terrence had to have control over her, over their daughter, and when he lost that control, he couldn't handle it. His mind, twisted by years of rejection, turned to violence as the only solution. The day before the murders, Malika had received a text from Terrence. It was a message that seemed innocent enough at first, a seemingly benign check-in. But when Malika read it, she felt a chill run down her spine. The words were cryptic, hinting at things that weren't being said outright. He had asked about Jairah, about the plans for Easter, about her new boyfriend. And then, in a way that only someone familiar with the dangers of their past would recognize, he slipped in a warning. He wasn't happy with how things were going. He wasn't happy with her moving on, with her finding happiness without him. But Malika, determined to move forward, didn't respond to his implied threats. She had made a choice to be free of him, to build a life for herself and her daughter. The next day, they spent Easter as they had every year, a quiet celebration, just the two of them, away from the chaos that had once been their lives. The meal was shared, the laughter was real, and in that moment, it seemed as if Malika had found peace at last. What she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that this simple act of living, of moving on, would seal her fate. To Terrence, it was the final insult. The family he had tried to control, the woman he had loved and lost, had moved on without him. In his mind, this was unforgivable. And so, he waited. He waited for nightfall. As darkness settled over the town, Terrence was already on the move. The authorities would later uncover that he had been parked outside Malika's house for hours, watching them, waiting for the moment when he could finally get what he wanted, the final act of control. He had armed himself with a gun, the weapon that would carry out the tragic violence. His mind was clouded by rage, by obsession, and by the belief that if he couldn't have Malika, no one else could. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about power. He wanted to make sure that Malika and Jairah would never get to live the life they had so freely embraced. He wanted to break them, just as he had been broken when Malika left him all those years ago. Inside the house, Malika and Jairah had no idea what was coming. They were oblivious to the fact that their lives would be forever altered by the pull of a trigger. Malika had always known that Terrence had a temper, that he was capable of violence. But she never imagined he would go this far. She thought he was in the past, a chapter that had been closed. And Jairah, young and full of life, could never have foreseen the nightmare that awaited her in the quiet of her own bedroom. When Terrence entered the house, it was with a purpose. The first shot rang out as Malika attempted to flee up the stairs, desperately trying to protect her daughter. The bullet struck her with deadly force, but she kept moving, a mother's instinct to shield her child pushing her forward. The second shot found its mark, and Malika crumpled to the floor. Her body was found just steps away from Jairah's room. The horror didn't end there. Terrence made his way to Jairah's bedroom, where the young girl was still unaware of what was happening. It was the last place she would ever be. As Terrence fired, Jairah's life was extinguished in an instant. She never had the chance to cry out, to fight back, to understand the nightmare unfolding before her. Her innocence, her future gone. The scene was one of utter devastation. A mother and her child, both violently taken from this world, both lost to a man who had become consumed by his own darkness. As the authorities pieced together the timeline, as the neighbors reported hearing gunshots in the distance, the realization grew clearer. This wasn't just a murder. This was an act of terror, an act driven by obsession and rage, fueled by jealousy and a desire for control. It was the tragic consequence of a relationship that had never truly ended, one that had simply been waiting to explode. With every detail that emerged, the story only became more unsettling. The idea that someone could be so consumed by their own pain, their own jealousy, that they would take away the lives of two innocent people shook everyone to their core. But even as the authorities closed in on Terrence, even as they collected evidence and built their case, the question remained, why? Why had he gone to such lengths to destroy the very people he had once loved? As the investigation continued, those closest to Malika began to share more about her struggles with Terrence. They spoke of his controlling nature, his inability to let go, his constant presence in her life, even after their relationship had ended. He had never stopped watching her, never stopped trying to force his way back into her life. And in the end, it was this relentless obsession, this need to control, that had driven him to kill. With every passing hour, the weight of the tragedy sank deeper into the hearts of those who had known Malika and Jairah. The sorrow was palpable, and yet, the anger remained. How could someone do this? How could a man who had once loved them turn so violently against them? The answers were coming, but they weren't enough to undo the heartbreak, to bring back what had been taken. As the weeks passed, the investigation began to take a clearer shape, though the answers still seemed agonizingly out of reach. The authorities had already narrowed their focus to Terrence, but they needed the undeniable proof to secure an arrest. What followed would be a series of breakthroughs that would bring the horror of that Easter night into sharp, undeniable focus. The first break came with the discovery of Terrence's phone records. Detectives knew that tracking a person's movements could often provide critical clues, and Terrence had made one fatal mistake. When he'd arrived at Malika's house that evening, he had left a trail. A series of texts and calls were traced back to his phone, communications that had begun hours before the murders. One chilling detail stood out. Just hours before Malika and Jairah were killed, Terrence had sent a final text to Malika, an ominous one-liner. "You'll regret this." The text didn't give much away at first, but as investigators pieced together his actions, it began to paint a terrifying picture. It was a threat, a final warning to a woman he could no longer control. But this time, Malika had chosen to ignore it, and that choice would cost her dearly. The fact that this message had been sent just hours before the murders wasn't lost on the detectives. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was premeditated. Terrence had planned this. He had prepared himself for it, and now there was no turning back. Then came the breakthrough that would change everything. A single piece of evidence found at the crime scene that no one had initially noticed. It wasn't the bloodstains, the broken furniture, or the discarded Easter decorations. It was something much more subtle, an empty shell casing, just behind the door to Jairah's bedroom. The casing was unique. a rare type of bullet that had only been used in one of Terrence's past run-ins with the law. It was a firearm he had been in possession of years ago, one that had been confiscated during an earlier domestic dispute with another ex-girlfriend. That gun had been deemed unregistered, and for a time, it was locked away. But it seemed that Terrence had never truly let go of his old weapon. As detectives pulled at the thread of this discovery, they found that Terrence had somehow managed to get his hands on a similar firearm again. They weren't sure how, but it didn't matter now. The casing matched the caliber used to murder both Malika and Jairah. It was all coming together. It was no longer a matter of if Terrence was guilty. It was a matter of how he would be brought to justice. But the most crucial piece of evidence came next, and it wasn't from a forensics report or a witness statement. It was from Terrence himself. On the day he was finally brought in for questioning, detectives noticed something that struck them as strange. Terrence's demeanor was too calm for someone who had just lost everything. He didn't seem like a grieving ex-stepfather or a remorseful killer. He seemed distant, detached, as if he were simply going through the motions of being questioned, trying to appear innocent in the face of overwhelming evidence. The breakthrough came when they presented him with the evidence they had gathered, his phone records, the unique bullet casing, and the timeline of events that had pointed squarely to him. They watched as Terrence's expression changed, as his confidence faltered, just slightly. There was a moment of silence, then a deep breath, and then he spoke. "I didn't want to do it," Terrence said. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the weight of the words. It was as though he were confessing, but in the same breath, trying to justify the monstrous act. "I just couldn't handle her having someone else. It wasn't supposed to go this far." The confession hung in the air, chilling in its simplicity. He didn't express remorse. He didn't plead for forgiveness. No. Instead, there was an eerie resignation, as though he was rationalizing his actions, as though he had been pushed too far, and the violence had been the only way to regain the control he so desperately craved. As he recounted the events of that fateful evening, the detectives remained silent, absorbing his words. It was clear that Terrence saw himself as the victim in all of this. His twisted sense of entitlement had led him to believe that the lives of Malika and Jairah were his to control, his to destroy when he saw fit. And then, as the truth finally began to sink in, Terrence said something that would haunt the investigators for days to come. "It's all her fault," he said quietly. "She made me do it. If she had just stayed with me, none of this would have happened." As the confession echoed in the room, it became clear Terrence's twisted sense of reality had led him to believe that he was justified in his actions. There was no remorse, no sorrow, only an unsettling conviction that he had been right all along. For Malika and Jairah, the world had ended in an instant. For Terrence, the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. The authorities knew they had enough to arrest him, to charge him with 2 counts of murder and ensure that he would never again have the chance to destroy another life. But the real question lingered. How many more lives would have to be shattered before society finally recognized the danger that lurked in the minds of those who couldn't let go of their obsessions, their need for control? How many more innocent people would have to die before the truth about this kind of violence became impossible to ignore? As Terrence was led out of the interrogation room, one thing was clear: the horrors of Easter night would never be forgotten. Not by those who loved Malika and Jairah, not by the community they had left behind, and not by anyone who heard their story. The search for justice had only just begun. The days that followed Terrence's confession were a whirlwind of legal battles and media frenzy. As the news of his arrest spread, the small community in New Jersey was left in shock. People who had known Terrence, those who had once seen him as the quiet stepfather, could scarcely believe the horrifying truth that had been revealed. How could a man who had once been trusted to care for Malika and her daughter turn into a cold-blooded killer? The answer, however unsettling, was now in plain view. The truth was inescapable. The trial was set to begin, but not before the prosecutors made it clear that they would pursue the maximum penalty. Terrence had taken the lives of 2 innocent people, his twisted motivations driven by jealousy and an insatiable need for control. The case became a public spectacle as the media swarmed to cover every detail, every shocking revelation that emerged. The family and friends of Malika and Jairah were forced to relive the painful memories of their loss in front of an audience that, for many, felt more like an intrusion than an act of justice. The victims' families, devastated and grieving, fought to maintain their dignity as the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. Malika's mother, heartbroken and bewildered by her daughter's brutal death, spoke in front of the jury, recounting the joy Malika had felt in the days leading up to her murder. She spoke of her daughter's hopes for the future, of her unshakable love for Jairah, and the way she had worked so hard to provide for her family. The courtroom was silent as Malika's mother wiped away her tears, the grief she felt obvious in every word. Jairah's aunt, too, delivered an emotional statement. She recalled the laughter of a young girl who had so much promise, who had just begun to blossom into adolescence, only to have her life extinguished in a moment of unthinkable violence. Terrence's defense team attempted to argue that he wasn't in full control of his actions, suggesting that his emotional turmoil and feelings of abandonment had clouded his judgment. They even tried to paint him as a victim of a broken relationship, a man pushed to the brink by Malika's rejection. But the prosecution's case was airtight. They presented the evidence, the text message, the phone records, the shell casings, and the confession, painting a clear picture of a man who had deliberately planned and carried out the murders of his ex-girlfriend and her daughter. There was no room for doubt. Throughout the trial, Terrence remained eerily calm. He sat in the courtroom, staring straight ahead, as though the gravity of what he had done had never truly sunk in. His demeanor was cold and detached, like a man who had resigned himself to the inevitable. He never once showed remorse for his actions, nor did he express any regret for the lives he had destroyed. His only words during the proceedings came from the statement he made in the interrogation room, a twisted justification for the violence he had inflicted. When the jury deliberated, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Family members and community members alike held their breath, praying for justice. It wasn't just a verdict they were waiting for, it was a sense of closure, a way to make sense of the senseless. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a decision. The courtroom fell silent once more as the foreman announced the verdict, guilty on all counts. Terrence's face remained expressionless as the words sank in. There was no relief in the room, only a sense of finality. He would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. His sentence was handed down swiftly, and the court recessed. Justice had been served, but for the families of Malika and Jairah, the pain of their loss would never fade. No prison sentence could bring them back. In the months following the trial, the community began to heal, but the scars of that tragic night would never fully disappear. Malika's and Jairah's names were honored with memorial services and tributes. Loved ones kept their memories alive by sharing stories of their lives, of Malika's strength and determination as a mother, of Jairah's vibrant spirit, and her dreams that were never given the chance to come to fruition. The community rallied around the grieving families, providing support and solace, but nothing could ever fill the void left by their senseless deaths. As for Terrence, his life was now confined to the walls of a prison. His name would forever be associated with the brutal murders of a mother and her daughter, and no amount of justification could change the horror of his actions. The twisted entitlement he had felt, the belief that he had a right to control Malika and Jairah, had led him down a path of destruction that could never be undone. His name would fade into infamy, a reminder of the consequences of unchecked rage and obsession. In the aftermath of the case, many asked the question, could this tragedy have been prevented? Could someone have seen the warning signs earlier? Could someone have intervened before Terrence's rage consumed him? Unfortunately, questions like these often linger long after the case is closed, a testament to the difficulty of predicting violence in individuals who seem normal on the outside. And as he sat alone in his prison cell, he would have nothing left but the weight of his own choices, a grim reminder of the horrific consequences of one man's thirst for control. What do you think? Was justice truly served in this case? Or were there deeper, unspoken motives that influenced Terrence's actions? Do you believe there were signs that could have been spotted earlier, perhaps preventing this tragic loss of life? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your theories. Was this a crime of passion, or was there something more chilling at play? Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more gripping true crime stories that uncover the darkest corners of our society. Hit the like button if this story made you think, and share it with someone who needs to hear the truth about the tragic fate of Malika and Jairah.